Welcome to the conversation about nutrition and your child. Hi, my name is Carla Carter. I am an occupational therapist, the Director of Education and Programs at the National Celiac Association. And joining me tonight co-hosting is Stacy Yunke, our Program Support Manager. Hi, Stacy. And of course, our speaker, but give me a moment and I will introduce her. Before I do, I just wanted to go over a couple of things. This meeting is a series and a complementary piece to our NCA ROC program, Raising Our Celiac Kids, which addresses the unique needs of kids and teens with celiac disease and non-celiac gluten and wheat sensitivities. Please note this is an educational meeting and no information is intended for the diagnosis or treatment of any condition. So please consult with your healthcare provider regarding the health of your child. And then for today's event, you are welcome to ask general questions. We aren't able to dig into the nitty-gritty personal questions, but use that chat feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This was meant to be kind of a nice roundtable event, so hopefully we'll get to have some nice back and forth. But there were a lot of people registered for tonight, and there were a lot of questions submitted ahead of time. So we're going to do our best to address questions during the presentation and then afterwards and through the chat, as well as the ones that were submitted ahead of time. And if your question doesn't get answered, we've got a lot of great resources on our website, especially our Ask the Experts page and our ROC landing pages. Please remain muted for the duration of this meeting unless you are going to speak or called upon to ask a question or participate in the conversation. It is, again, tricky with Zoom. I'm sure you guys have all been on enough Zoom meetings to know that Zoom doesn't love it when there's background noise and more than one person talking. So thank you. So that's it for housekeeping tips. I know you are all excited to hear Renee Euler speak. She is a registered dietitian nutritionist and the owner of a private practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico, specializing in gastrointestinal conditions and celiac disease. She understands the importance of receiving accurate nutrition advice for celiac disease. And she's also herself maintained a gluten-free diet for almost 30 years. She has a long history of leading support groups, previously in Chicago, and currently leads one of NCA's chapters in Albuquerque. A general lack of support for people with celiac disease and a desire to help others led her to her second career in nutrition. She received both her bachelor's and master's degrees in nutrition from the University of New Mexico. So I'm going to stop sharing and now Renee share her screen and take it from here.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much, Carla and Stacy, for having me to speak tonight. As Carla said, I myself have celiac disease. It will be 30 years that I have been diagnosed in September of this year. So long time dealing with celiac and a gluten-free diet myself. So some of you may be. Oh, sorry.
Not a normal.
Oh, sorry. So I'm going to jump in here and let's see if I can get this little Zoom bar moved out of the way so I can see my screen. But yeah, so we're going to just talk about nutrient concerns with celiac disease. There's some of the abbreviations that I'll be using throughout. So CED for celiac, and then nutrient concerns with a gluten-free diet, so GFD. And then we'll just talk about healthy eating guidelines for kids, which are applicable to our celiac kids as well. So let's jump right in. So nutrient concerns of celiac disease. Of course, most of us probably know that celiac, depending on how long you've been diagnosed, we may have some newcomers here, but celiac is a malabsorptive disease. So those villi, and I always raise my hands and talk about villi, and I do my shag carpet impression when I talk about villi, but we've got these villi in the small intestine. They're kind of like anemones that reach out and grab those nutrients. And so what happens with celiac disease is those villi get damaged, and I'm a child of the 70s, so to me, it's shag carpet versus linoleum. So we have less shag carpet to grab our nutrients when we have celiac disease, and especially when it's untreated, when it's newly diagnosed. And so we've got those damaged villi that just are not able to absorb those nutrients that we need. So because of that, so nutrient deficiencies are quite common with newly diagnosed or untreated celiac disease. So of course, with our kiddos, that's a concern, right? They are growing during this period of time. It's pretty important for them to have the nutrients they need to get to their full potential. That said, it's pretty amazing. After a year on a gluten-free diet, about 95% of children, their gut lining has healed. They're much more resilient than the adults. So I work mostly with adults. I see some celiac kids, but my adults, they struggle with getting their gut lining healed over time. But with the kiddos, they really seem to be, kids are resilient. So 95% of kids, the gut lining is healed after a year on a gluten-free diet. So we're getting back to that full absorption of those nutrients. So that's pretty important there. But that said, at diagnosis, we may want to talk to our provider about ordering some of those nutrient labs. And we're going to talk about some specifics. I know that was a lot of the questions that came in on the questions when people signed up. So along with those celiac antibodies that we have at diagnosis, there may be some other tests. So it depends on the provider. There are no formal guidelines from any of the celiac organizations about follow-up care. There's no written guidelines. There's a lot of you'll find different organizations like NCA and different ones that have recommendations, but there's no formal guidelines. So a lot of them are sort of like, well, this organization or this doctor, my doctor does this or this doctor does that. And even the same different doctors in the same practice may treat patients slightly different. So when we are first diagnosed, it is recommended in adults, but also in children generally, to have those nutrient labs taken as well. And we'll talk specifics here in a second. And then we want to retest those nutrient labs if there's something out of whack. We want to retest those every 3 to 6 months until they're normalized. It depends, again, follow-up testing for those celiac antibodies depends on providers. I have providers that I work with that want to retest celiac antibodies every 3 months until they're normalized. I have some providers that want to retest every 6 months until they're normalized. So it really can kind of depend on the provider. Like I said, there's no formal guidelines on that. So if it's 6 months, that's okay. If your pediatrician says, let's do it in 6 months, that's okay too. But because we're getting that nutrient absorption back after that, going on that gluten-free diet, they're probably starting to absorb nutrients better again right away. But we want to retest every 3 to 6 months until they're normalized, and then ideally annually with some of those nutrients, especially if it's ones that were troublesome and trying to get back to normal levels, vitamin D and iron being two of those in my mind that I watch a lot. And then we want to do, annually or every other year, depending again on the provider. There's not a specific recommendation for that. So this is a conversation with you and your pediatrician and maybe pediatric GI if you're still seeing them about what makes sense for your child. What is making sense for the child that we're dealing with right here, and how their celiac disease presented, what their celiac antibodies look like. Do they have other conditions that might be playing into this? Lots of different things there. So that's a discussion to have. Of course, we want to be looking at growth patterns too, and maybe some other testing, things like thyroid antibodies. Sometimes we want to, or thyroid screen. Sometimes we want to be aware if there's type 1 diabetes in the family, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of things that can kind of go into that follow-up care. All right, next slide. Hang on. There we go. So this is something that's on the NCA website that you can have access to. And so this is a suggested timeline. Again, this is NCA and what they've gathered based upon their medical and nutrition advisory board and what they know too. You'll find slight differences between different timelines between organizations about follow-up care. But at diagnosis, a lot of times we'll have that complete blood count, some of these other tests, and we'll go into some of these in more detail to understand sort of what's going on and whether additional testing is needed. Bone density scans generally are not recommended for kiddos at this point in time unless there's some other concerns going on because they're growing and they really do pop out of that pretty quickly and start reabsorbing. And hopefully there's no long-term effects on their bone densities. That bone density scan is generally for adults. But again, case-by-case basis with kiddos as to whether or not that is necessary at that time. So again, 3 to 6 months, it depends again on the provider, whether that makes sense. Sometimes I will see as a dietitian, I will see patients again pretty quickly after diagnosis, give them a month or two to go home and sort of figure out what the heck's going on and how to do a gluten-free diet, and then see them pretty quickly. I often, especially with kids, don't want to leave them for 6 months on their own. I'd rather check in again in 2 to 3 months and kind of see how they're doing. If there's anything that needs to be, adjusted, if they are having issues of whatever type, that we can get those addressed sooner rather than later. But then again, too, so at 6 months, we want to check on those celiac antibodies, and maybe if there were micronutrient deficiencies, this is a good time to test again, depending on what the presentation of the child was at that point in time. And of course, too, looking at those growth patterns. That's something that we always want to be paying attention to with kiddos. And then at 1 year, visits with the GI and the dietitian. Again, some gastroenterologists will do a repeat endoscopy, but not very often, and especially even more rare with kiddos, depending on what their presentation initially looked like. But again, monitoring kids for growth, maybe doing some of that blood work, depending on what the blood work looked like at 6 months, but depending on what it looked like at diagnosis, it may be necessary. And then, following up every year. And sometimes that may be with the pediatrician, and sometimes that may be with pediatric GI. I know a lot of GIs are like, yeah, you're good, right? And so that's where, as parents, we can really advocate for our child with the pediatrician and say, hey, you know what? We're not really seeing peds GI anymore, and that's okay. We're doing okay. But hey, can we do some blood work with the pediatrician and just make sure that things are okay? So you can also advocate for your child with other providers, not just with pediatric GI. I do that myself as an adult because a lot of times I've had different GIs, and sometimes my PCP was my more consistent provider and was able to manage that for me. So it kind of depends, again, on the individual and the individual kiddo and their situation. So let's talk about some of these common vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So the most common ones that we see at diagnosis deficiencies are iron and zinc. Calcium, vitamin D are issues as well, folate and B12 too. So those guys are kind of the big group that I see the most issues with. And so let's just talk through some of these guys. What do they do for us? Why are they important, right? Why do we need iron? Why do we need zinc? And then what foods do they come from? So that we can have an idea when we're feeding our children, oh, they were iron deficient at diagnosis and they're still struggling with iron deficiency. Oh, these are the foods that can help with that. Of course, we want to get the gluten out of the diet so that we get that absorption back. We get those villi, we get our anemones grabbing things again. But we want to make sure then that we're providing a variety of foods to help meet these vitamin and mineral needs. So iron is a big one. It helps carry oxygen to our cells. And so it's part of the hemoglobin complex. And so there's an iron molecule in the center of each one of those four peptides that make up the hemoglobin, for those of you in healthcare, the hemoglobin molecule. So carrying oxygen to cells, which is why one of the most significant and often the most telling or initial symptom of iron deficiency, and we don't have to have full-blown anemia, we can just be iron deficient a little bit, is fatigue, right? And especially fatigue related to exercise or doing physical activity of some sort, right? If kiddos are no longer able, if they get exhausted during gym class or what have you. So iron deficiency, iron helps carry the oxygen to the cells. So that's where we can sometimes see it with kids sort of most noticeable, maybe as a parent, like their energy levels are just not normal. So that's important. Also, too, iron is really important for growth and development. When I teach community college nutrition, and when I teach about iron, we talk about, and when we talk about kids, we talk about how micronutrients, so iron and zinc and the ones that we're talking about right now are what we call micronutrients. We need these nutrients in small amounts. But micronutrients help us grow tall. And so things like iron and zinc help us with our growth and development. They help us grow tall. So that's really important. It helps with muscle development. It helps with hormone production, which is going to help with growth. All of those sorts of things. You can kind of see I paired iron and zinc here because they both have similar roles in that for our kids. And luckily, they're similarly in a lot of similar foods too. So iron, meat, poultry, fish, beans, nuts, and seeds, those are all good sources of iron. Other good sources of iron are leafy greens as well, but a lot of kiddos don't eat a lot of leafy greens. But we get iron in lots of foods, but those are kind of our high containing foods. Also, too, so some things to be aware of. Excess milk consumption can interfere with iron absorption. We see this a lot of times in kiddos, especially under like the age of like 3, where they're drinking a lot of milk every day. And not necessarily celiac kids, just kids in general, when they're drinking a lot of milk every day, so greater than 24 ounces of cow's milk a day, that can interfere with iron absorption. So that's something to consider if your kiddo is not lactose intolerant, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But if your kiddo is not lactose intolerant and they drink a lot of milk, yes, it is very nutritious, but if they're dealing with iron deficiency, we may want to moderate that so that we can absorb both the iron and what's going on there is iron and calcium don't play nice together. And so they're binding each other and we're not able to absorb it as well. Also, too, iron in our teenage girls. Those of you ladies on the call may remember when you started your menstrual cycle, oftentimes it's quite heavy. And so we're losing iron on a monthly basis in our teenage girls through their menstrual cycle. And so that can be sort of an addition on top of if they have celiac disease and they have iron deficiency, or even full-blown iron deficiency anemia, and then they also have a heavy menstrual cycle. Sometimes that needs to be dealt with, but also to recognizing that if you know that your celiac teen or preteen, has heavy menstrual cycles, it may be something to pay attention to closely as well. So then zinc, so again, growth and development, just like the iron, hormone development, especially those reproductive hormones, which is important in that sort of pre-pubertal and puberty stages. Thyroid health and immune function, zinc is really important there too. So pretty good one that we want to pay attention to. Again, it comes in meat, poultry, but also shellfish, dairy products, beans and lentils, nuts and seeds, whole grains. So a lot of places. But these are 2 vitamins and minerals, because of where they're absorbed in the small intestine, often can be problematic for people with celiac disease at diagnosis initially when they're getting their gut healing back, or when they're getting their gut lining back, I should say. So then too, we also get concerned, especially because kiddos are growing, and we get concerned about calcium and vitamin D. These are 2 that are challenging, especially if we have untreated celiac disease before diagnosis. So calcium can take a hit in terms of not being absorbed very well, and then vitamin D as well. And so calcium and vitamin D are like best girlfriends. They need each other to be absorbed. They can't go to the bathroom without each other. So we want to have both of them. And calcium for a lot of kids, depending on their diet, it may be a struggle for them to get adequate calcium in their diet. But really important for bone and tooth development. And somebody sent in a question ahead of time asking about how is this going to affect my kid's dental sort of journey. And so that is important. So calcium is important for both bones and for teeth. And so being cognizant of that in terms of your child's diet, where are they getting calcium from? And then also too, for muscle contraction, your heartbeat, calcium is a very important nutrient. So dairy products, right? That is where the majority of people get their calcium from, because most Americans, and especially kids, are not very good at getting calcium in other places, right? So tofu is a great place to get calcium, but a lot of kids are not eating tofu. But also too, leafy greens, beans, nuts, and seeds. A lot of our kids and a lot of our adults, right? A lot of adults in the US do not eat enough leafy greens, beans, nuts, and seeds to get calcium from other sources. So we're going to talk about lactose intolerance here in a few minutes, but so dairy products or fortified dairy alternatives are good sources, but we need to pay attention. Does it have calcium in it because of its importance? So then too, vitamin D, again, helpful with bone, tooth, and development and maintenance and other things too. I'm sort of putting the highlights here. Most of these vitamins and minerals have, thousands of purposes, but I'm putting kind of the big highlights as related to sort of kids and growth and development. So vitamin D, we can get vitamin D in fortified milk. I know my grandmother always called whole milk vitamin D milk. I don't know why. I'm not entirely sure what the history is on that, but all cow's milk that you buy at the grocery store has added vitamin D because it helps prevent rickets in kids. We started adding vitamin D to milk decades ago to help prevent and help produce strong bones in kids. So milk, generally the milk that you buy, the cow's milk that you buy has vitamin D on it, and it will say on the label. Also, orange juice, and I should have added that to the calcium column. So there's a lot of orange juice that is now being fortified with calcium and vitamin D. So that is something that you can look for too if your kiddo doesn't do well with dairy products. That can be an option. The industry sort of recognized that a lot of people aren't drinking cow's milk anymore. So where else can we put calcium and vitamin D in the diet to help with that? And so there are some orange juices. Not all orange juice has vitamin or has calcium and vitamin D. You have to look at the label and read it and see. The other places vitamin D comes is fatty fish like tuna and salmon, eggs, and sunlight. And this is why so many of us, even me, I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 300 plus days of sun a year. And we still often don't get enough vitamin D here from the sun. A lot of us wear sunscreen, right? A lot of us put sunscreen on our kids, especially the young ones. And so they're not getting vitamin D from the sunlight. And most of them are not eating a whole lot of fatty fish. Maybe they're eating some eggs on a regular basis. But if they're not drinking cow's milk, they may not be getting vitamin D in any other places. So vitamin D in particular, supplementation may be necessary even after their gut has healed. Just in general, as a general nutrient concern, vitamin D is an issue for a lot of people, regardless of whether they have celiac disease or not. So supplementation, sometimes for life, may be necessary, just depending on what their diet consists of, what their outdoor habits are, and all of that sort of stuff. Where they live, if you live like Stacy does in the very northern part of the country, they get a lot less sunlight up there. So that can play a role as well. So some of the B vitamins, the big ones that we worry about the most are folate and vitamin B12. So folate is also known as B9, but these are part of the group of B12, B vitamins. So folate supports making new cells. Vitamin B12 also helps make new cells, but more importantly, it's with the DNA and the nervous system. So these guys have very important roles in keeping our bodies, working well. So folate, I always tell people think of the word foliage, right? I'm going leaf peeping. I'm going to go look for foliage. Folate comes from green vegetables in particular, but all vegetables have some level of folate in them. Fruit and fruit juice has folate in them. Beans and lentils, they're plants. They're from leafy plants, right? They have folate in them as well as whole grains and fortified grains. Sometimes will be fortified with folate as well. So something to consider. This is why folate for a lot of people and a lot of kiddos with celiac can be an issue because a lot of times they're not getting enough fruits and veggies, beans, lentils, whole grains, those sorts of things too. Vitamin B12, so as like I said, very important with the nervous system function, important to make our DNA so that our cells can reproduce. All of that is very important. B12 comes in animal products, only in animal products. So meat, poultry, fish, seafood, eggs, and dairy products. There are fortified dairy alternatives that have B12 in them, and there's nutritional yeast, and sometimes you can find things like krill oil, but generally animal products. Some people argue whether yeast is a live animal product or not. But so whether or not we get B12, if we're following a vegetarian diet, if we're a young teenage girl and we're trying on life and my niece went through this stage where she was like, I'm going to be a vegetarian, right? In those teenage years where they're trying to figure out who they are. Sometimes we can go through that time period where maybe they're choosing to not eat animal products. And so we want to be aware of that B12 potentially could be an issue if we are not consuming any animal products, if we're vegetarian and we're on a low animal product diet, or if we're vegan and we're not having any animal products. So something to be aware of. So this was a lot of the questions that were sent in ahead of time. Supplementation. Should I give my kiddo a multivitamin or any sort of supplements? So supplements, I just will get on my soapbox for like 10 seconds, but the supplement industry is not well regulated. It's the fox watching the hen house. So we do have to be careful as people with celiac disease because there is not as stringent of guidelines on supplements as there are on pharmaceuticals. And so we do need to be cautious, and we also need to recognize that the supplement industry wants your money as well as the pharmaceutical industry. And so we need to be cognizant of that we don't want to be over supplementing. More is not always better. I constantly get patients in my office, mostly adults, not the kids so much, but adults that are just taking every supplement that they see at Costco when they walk in the door. And so we want to be cognizant of that. Again, throwing supplements at the issue is not necessarily going to solve everything. And potentially, especially with celiac, that may be an issue. But if we have nutrient deficiencies in our kiddos, sometimes a gluten-free multivitamin with minerals is needed. And we'll look at a vitamin label here in a minute. So not all multivitamins have the minerals in them. So that's something we need to be cognizant of too, and reading the label to know that, yes, my kiddo has iron deficiency at diagnosis. I need to get them a multivitamin, but I want to make sure it has iron in it. So we need to be cognizant of that. Sometimes we can just do individual nutrient supplements. So things like vitamin D. We can buy vitamin D supplements separate, and we can dose according to the child's healthcare provider based upon what their lab values are. And we can do individual nutrient supplements if that's needed. Or maybe we just do an iron supplement with a teenage girl. It kind of depends. Again, it's a conversation to have based upon your child's lab values, what their overall health history looks like, what other conditions they might have, and really figure out what an appropriate dosing is with their pediatrician or their pediatric GI doc. So I'm not a huge supplement person. So I am very cautious. Being celiac, I am very cautious with supplements. And also too, just seeing the potential for toxicity in these things, because a lot of people just continue adding on supplements without paying attention and looking at the full picture. Parents don't do this as much, but a lot of my over 55 folks that I see do that a lot. But the risk of toxicity is increased with supplementation, in particular of iron. We don't want to go overboard on iron. We don't want to go overboard on calcium. More is not always better when it comes to, especially to those. Our body does not have easy ways of getting rid of those when we have too much. So also too, vitamins A, D, E, and K. So the fat soluble vitamins, we often,
Done now, Mom.
I hesitate to supplement with the fat soluble vitamins just because they have a higher risk of toxicity because they stay in our body as well. Also, too, B3, which is also known as niacin, and B6, we don't want to get too high levels on those guys either. And so those are, so that's where it's not always a good thing to take more of it. So that's why the big red circle, more is not always better. That said, sometimes we will use very high doses for short-term treatment with a healthcare provider. So sometimes you will see doctors prescribing high levels of vitamin D temporarily to patients. So that's where sometimes it can be, but it's a short period of time. Maybe it's 6, 8 weeks or 12 weeks that they're doing the high dose and then they stop. Or they go to a very low maintenance dose after that. So again, working with the healthcare provider, your child's healthcare provider, trying to figure out what is best in that particular situation. So in terms of choosing a multivitamin, so this is a sample. Some of you guys may recognize it. This is one that I commonly will recommend because it's easily found. But what we want to be paying attention to is what deficiencies does my child have, if any? And then we want to make sure that we're targeting those and that the multivitamin that we choose has those in it. Because gummy vitamins or chewable vitamins don't always have the minerals. They don't often have the iron or the zinc in them. So the gummy vitamins, the minerals don't play nice, again, from a chemistry standpoint. So it's very challenging to get very much iron or zinc and those things like that, calcium into those gummy forms. So just from a chemistry standpoint, we just can't make it happen. So if we are choosing a gummy vitamin or a chewable vitamin for our kid, especially the gummy vitamins, they don't always have the minerals in them. So we want to look and make sure. This one is a complete multivitamin. It's not a gummy. But multivitamins are typically low in calcium. So you can see some things that I highlighted over here. So you can see here, we've got a full 100% of iron for kiddos. And so you can see up here the percent daily value. And so this column over here, this is for, the first one's for ages 2 to 3 years of age at a half a tablet, and then the needs for kids that are 4 years of age or older. And you can see here for most of these, so like for iron, we've got 18 milligrams on that line right there. And then we've got 129% for kids under the age of 3. And then for kids 4 and older, it's 100% of their daily value, what is recommended. And so we want to look at those and see, does it have very much in it? Because a lot of us don't know whether 100 milligrams of calcium is enough or not, right? So looking at these percentages can tell you, does this have enough iron in it for my kiddo? Yeah, it does. The other thing too is when we buy a multivitamin, especially for our kids, we want to make sure that most of the numbers, most of the percentages in this column for the kid, for the age group of our child, that they don't exceed more than 300% of that daily value. So you can see, so this is why I like this multivitamin, is because it's not excessive. There are a lot of multivitamins, more so for adults out there, that get excessive with the amounts of nutrients that they put in these things. And so you can see here, you know, copper is at 222%, so not bad. Again, staying under that 300%. You can see here, you know, and it's creeping up there a little bit for kids under the age of 3, but that's not horrible. But you can see here vitamin B12 is one that we'll often see in very high amounts in these nutrients, and that one's okay to have super high. But in general, I want most of these under 300%, just because we don't need to be overloading our child with a bunch of nutrients either, because that isn't always a good thing either. And then, of course, we want to look for one that's labeled gluten-free. And you can kind of see it off to the edge. I couldn't get everything in the picture here. And so you can see this one has no lactose, and you can see over there in that white square it says gluten-free. So looking for one, of course, that's gluten-free. But you can see, as I mentioned, you know, a lot of multivitamins are low in calcium. So this one only has 100 milligrams, which is 7 or 8% of the recommendation for the age group of those children. So depending on what's going on with the kiddo, and maybe they're not eating a whole lot of calcium, this multivitamin may not be enough calcium for them. So those are all some things that we need to consider when choosing a multivitamin. But I do like this one as a very general sort of recommendation, just because it's easy to find. So some other possible dietary patterns of concern, and somebody did send in a note or a question about dairy. So if our child, so we have to recognize there's a difference between a dairy allergy and lactose intolerance. If the kid has true dairy allergy, right, that we have hives and we have swelling of the mouth and itching of the mouth and things like that, that is one issue. Most kids with celiac disease do not have a dairy allergy, right? That does not typically go along with celiac disease. Of course, they can have it in addition to celiac disease, but most kids with celiac disease have lactose intolerance. And so that's where they might have diarrhea, gas, and bloating when they consume dairy products. And sometimes the diagnosis can be a little hard to sort of figure out. Is it the celiac disease and now we're going gluten-free and things are improving? Or now we're getting gluten-free, but he's still having diarrhea? That may be lactose intolerance. And so with lactose intolerance does not mean that the kiddo needs to be on a dairy-free diet, right? We can still do dairy that is appropriate. And so we can look at things like yogurt, low lactose, kefir, low lactose. We can do hard cheeses. Those are low lactose. So there's a lot of options out there. If somebody is lactose intolerant, if a kiddo is lactose intolerant, it doesn't mean that they have to be on a dairy-free diet, because the lactose intolerance, if we take dairy out of the diet, the kiddos might not be getting enough calcium, might not be getting enough vitamin D. And then another one that we haven't talked about is B2, riboflavin, just because that's where most Americans get most of their riboflavin from, is from cow's milk. And so we want to acknowledge that with our kiddos that, you know, if we're lactose intolerant and we're limiting dairy, maybe we're over limiting dairy for those kiddos, that they may not be getting enough calcium and vitamin D in their lives. So we do want to acknowledge that and be cognizant of that as a parent. And if we are dairy, if we have a dairy allergy, then of course we need to address that. But what we do see with lactose intolerance is, again, those villi, right? Our shag carpet in our small intestine. Those little enzymes that digest our dairy are on the tips of the shag carpet. As the gut heals and those villi come back, a lot of times kiddos get their lactose digestion ability back. I was one of those. I was diagnosed at 19. I got my ability to digest lactose back. And so that's something to be cognizant of, and maybe like, hey, over time, maybe in 3 or 6 months, if we feel like maybe there was a little bit of lactose issue, let's try reintroducing lactose and see how the kiddo does, because again, it's an easy source of calcium and vitamin D that they may not be getting other places. Also, too, enzyme use. Lactase enzymes or lactate milk still has plenty of nutrients in it, all the same nutrients. It just has the lactose broken down by lactase enzymes. So enzyme use or products that have been have had lactose reduced. So like Fairlife milk is like 99% lactose free. So Fairlife brand milk, it's ultra pasteurized, it's ultra filtered, it's higher in protein, it's also lower in lactose. So for a lot of kids, that can be a really great option. Adults too. My mom loves the chocolate flavor. She has osteoporosis and she likes to get that into her diet. But that Fairlife brand of milk is very low in lactose. So that can be an option. Vegetarian, vegan diets too. Again, diet might be lacking in things like protein, iron, and zinc, because if you look back or you think back to what we talked about in terms of where those nutrients are coming from with the iron and zinc, animal products, right? So our meats are high protein products. So that may be an issue for vegetarian, vegan kiddos, depending on how well planned or thought out their diet might be. And then 2, calcium and vitamin D, again, if we're not getting those nutrients in other sources. And then vitamin B12, just because it mostly comes from animal sources. So those are all ones, depending on our individual child, you know, and their preferences and their dietary patterns, that can be an issue. Of course, too, other dietary concerns like picky eating, kiddos with intellectual developmental disabilities or on the spectrum. That's a whole nother level, right? Related to celiac disease plus something else that can be challenging for sure. It may require a full support team. It may require a dietitian, not just you as the parent, because that is challenging. It is tough to feed kiddos with picky eating, with other sensory issues and things like that. You may need a team. It may include a registered dietitian that is trained in helping with picky eating. You may also need, and I do recommend, a dietitian with a feeding therapist generally. So a feeding therapist, sometimes they're occupational therapists, sometimes they're speech and language pathology therapists, but you may require a support team to really help broaden that diet for that kiddo. It's really tough to do it alone. So do reach out to your healthcare team and see if there are options if you're struggling to help feed your child with some of these issues. Just a couple of resources. There's a great website. She's a dietitian, Kids Eat in Color, and she has some picky eating programs. So if it's just basic picky eating, she has some courses on our website that might be helpful. Ellen Satter Institute is really great. She's a dietitian as well as a family therapist. She has some really great books about feeding kids. And so she talks about some of the picky eating and how not to become a short order cook for one child and the rest of the family eats something different. So those might be some helpful resources. But I do encourage you, if you're really dealing with this and struggling with this, to get a support team put together. And then the potential gluten-free diet limitations. So gluten-free diet can be low in calcium, vitamin D. Magnesium is one that often in the gluten-free diet is just not there as much, but it comes, we haven't talked about it yet, but it comes in whole grains, greens, beans, nuts, and seeds. Again, a lot of people just don't get enough of those things in their diet. Not just celiac kids, right? But celiac adults as well as the general population often just do not get enough magnesium in their diet. And the gluten-free diet sort of is low in that, can be low in that nutrient. Zinc as well, and then a lot of our B vitamins, so folate, B6, B12 that I've talked about already. There's a whole group of B vitamins, but those three in particular, the gluten-free diet can be low in those, as well as fiber. And the reason for that is because most of the quote unquote regular, right, the gluten-containing grain-based foods have, so like our regular cereals, breads, and pastas are typically enriched with iron, zinc, and those B vitamins in particular. So when we move to a gluten-free product, oftentimes we're not getting that. I only know of one company, Kinnick, that fortifies their grain products, of their gluten-free grain products. Most of the gluten-free manufacturers do not fortify or enrich their foods, their grain-based foods, with these vitamins that the general public gets in these enriched foods, in their gluten-containing enriched foods. So that's where sometimes we are missing out as people with celiac disease, kids and adults. But I also want to say too that the typical standard American kids diets are often low in these nutrients too. So yes, the gluten-free diet can be low in those, but the kids diets in general, right? Like kids generally don't eat a whole lot of leafy greens and beans and nuts and seeds generally. So their diets for kiddos not eating gluten-free can also be maybe not as nutrient dense as we would like them to be, just like with celiac kids. So just be cognizant of that your kid, even though they have celiac disease, may just be like every other American kid in their diet choices and what nutrients are contained in those foods. So planning meals and snacks, of course, planning a healthy plate. And, this is something great that I love this tool. Make your plate half the plate fruit or veg, right? So this is something, I love this graphic because it speaks to all levels of education, kiddos, but also adults with low reading levels. Half your plate fruits and or vegetables when we eat. And so thinking about that, about how we can get a healthy plate. Plan for balanced snacks, right? Think of snacks as an opportunity to get more nutrients into your child, not an opportunity to just eat quote unquote junk food, right? So thinking about include a fruit or veg plus protein. And so planning for some of those balanced snacks, and we got some resources coming up. And then also recognizing too that fresh vegetables and fresh fruit are beneficial, but so are frozen and canned. So whatever texture your kiddo likes, a lot of kids do not like fresh blueberries because one blueberry is sweet, the next one is tart, and they sometimes have weird textures, right? So if your kiddo though likes frozen blueberries, perfect. That's awesome. Just as many nutrients in it as well, because these days most of our fruits and veggies are flash frozen or canned practically in the field. And so they still have nutrients in them. They are very beneficial. So don't feel like you have to always buy fresh and let it rot in the back of your fridge, or your kids decide they don't want it. All of those are beneficial. So utilizing frozen, utilizing canned fruits and veggies, all of those things are still a plus for our kiddos. So don't feel like you have to buy fresh. And then two, for our grain foods, for us with celiac disease, we have some whole grains, but we also have a lot of what we call pseudo grains, things like quinoa, but include those, right? So polenta or grits. I live in the Southwest, so cornmeal is very big here. Sorghum, buckwheat, millet. So learning ways to incorporate those and choosing grain products that have a mixed variety of grain foods in them, or grains. So proteins for kids. So I'm going to run through this really quick because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and I know we're getting close. So protein for kids. Most kids get adequate amounts of protein. Protein foods contain iron, zinc, and B12 that we talked about. Those are some of our nutrients of concern, but they don't need that much, right? So, and just like adults, we don't need as much as we're led to believe, but you can get it pretty quickly. So you can see, the different ranges here of how many grams of protein different age groups of kiddos need. And you'll see a difference often in those adolescent boys and girls in terms of how much they need. But you can see it's, yes, yes, it's in dairy products protein. Yes, it's in eggs and animal protein, but also black beans. A half a cup of brown rice has 3 grams of protein in it. And 1 cup of gluten-free pasta has 4 grams of protein in it. A half a cup of broccoli has 2.5 grams. And I always jokingly say an apple has a half a gram of protein. It all counts. It doesn't just have to come from animal protein, right? So this is why most of us get adequate amounts of protein, and most kids do too. So grain foods for kids. So this is a little bit more challenging. You can definitely go to the myplate.gov website and look up these recommendations. Those are the recommendations, and they're pretty consistent around the world. It's not just the US government that made those recommendations, but generally Canada, dietetics associations, and all of the other organizations in Europe have very similar recommendations. They may be off slightly, but they're generally the same. But you can see here, the amount of grain equivalents. And so they talk about ounce equivalents. So 1 ounce equivalent, you can see over here. So kiddos need grains. And of course, as they get bigger, they need a lot more grains. And we recommend 50% of those grains to be whole grains. And I jumped in and added the whole grain stamp that you can kind of sometimes see on products. The one that I noticed the most out of gluten-free products is Crunchmaster brand crackers have the whole grain stamp on them pretty consistently. Most of their products do. So you can look for this little stamp if you want to be increasing the amount of whole grains that your kiddo is getting. But you can see we can get it relatively easy, you know, in throughout our day, but we wanted to make sure that we're getting more whole grains. Fruits and veggies for kids. Less than 10% of kids, and I'll say adults too, less than 10% of kids, regardless of whether they have celiac disease or not, do not eat enough fruit and veg. So 10% of kids get enough fruits and veggies, which means they're getting folate, they're getting fiber, they're getting all of those important nutrients that we didn't talk about as well. So this is where a lot of us can do a lot more here and really bump up the amounts of fruits and veggies that we're giving to our kids and getting them to eat. So you can see the amounts that are recommended here. And again, celiac kids are no different than regular kids. A lot of them, unless they're exposed to it, they don't really want to eat fruits and veggies either. So working on that is important. So dairy alternatives for kids. So you can see the different age groups here and the amount that is recommended, and then what is considered 1 cup or 1 serving. I will note here that if you use dairy alternatives, if your kiddo is lactose intolerant, make sure that that dairy alternative has calcium and vitamin D in it. Most of them do not. Coconut milk does not. A lot of the almond milks do not. I jokingly call almond milk almond water because there's not a whole lot of nutrition in there. But you can see, so cow's milk, fortified soy milk. Soy milk is a great nutrient option, very similar in its nutrient profile to cow's milk in terms of protein and vitamin D and calcium, so it's an option. Yogurt is a good place. Natural cheeses and shredded cheeses, those are options as well. But again, if we're restricting dairy in our kiddos, that can be a real challenge to get the nutrients, the calcium and the vitamin D that they do need. So as I mentioned just quickly before, snacks, think of them as an opportunity as parents. And so thinking about how can I get some more nutrition into my kiddos? Can I make things with dips? Kids love dips, right? I actually took a yogurt-based fruit dip to book club yesterday, and all the women were like, this is so good, right? It's okay to dip things in ranch. It's okay to dip our carrots, baby carrots in ranch. It's okay, you know, to make a yogurt-based dip and dip those things in them so that we can get more of those vegetables and fruits into our kiddos and the adults. Here is a link, and maybe somebody, Stacy or Carla can put it in the chat, but this is from the Rock page. I'm hungry, what can I eat page, and it's actually, full disclosure, it's me writing that little part of that article about some snack ideas. So again, protein plus a fruit or veg, think of it that way. We can also think of the idea of snack plates, and this works for adults as well, but buying a grocery store veggie tray and putting it out while the kids are starving while you're making dinner, right? Put out that grocery store veggie tray. Most of the dips are gluten-free, so no worries there, or if choose your own gluten-free dip, but just put it out there on the table when they're starving, right? they're going to eat more fruits and veggies. You can also add some cut up string cheese, some nuts and seeds, some popcorn, some sliced fruit, like sliced apples, some whole grain gluten-free crackers, maybe even 2 little bags of fruit snacks if you have more than one kid. They're going to eat the fruit snacks, but they're also going to eat some of the veggies and some of the other nutrient dense foods too. So think about that. If you want ideas on Snack Plate, Real Mom Nutrition, she does a lot of pediatric nutrition articles. She has some great information on her website. She has some great snack plate ideas if you're interested in that idea. Prevention RD, also another dietitian who does a lot of feeding kids stuff too, or did. She doesn't do as much anymore, but they both have great resources on their website about Snack Plate and just getting more fruits and veggies into our kiddos. So that is the end, and I apologize. That went a lot longer than I thought it was going to, but I'm trying to stop sharing my screen and get back to you guys.
Thank you so much. You are back to us. The screen share is no longer there. We do have some questions that came in, but I know that I saw your slides before you saw the questions that everybody asked, and I know that you added a lot of beef to your slides to help answer some of those questions. So don't worry there. There are definitely some questions that came in, and this is a great one about if someone's newly diagnosed and they're not absorbing, are they even getting any of the supplements that are being prescribed?
Well, that's a good question. We wouldn't obviously know unless we were able to go in and, watch what was happening. But if we can add those supplements as they are healing, then they're going to start absorbing those, right? Because if your kiddo is already not eating some of those food groups that have those nutrients in them, at least if we're supplementing them as they begin to heal and as they start absorbing again, they're going to be getting those. And that can help with catch-up growth, right? I didn't really talk about that too much, but that was a question, some of the pre-presentation questions was about catch-up growth. So if we can get those in, as they're healing, then we may be helping them along faster.
Yeah. And will deficiencies always show up on labs?
No, not all nutrient deficiencies will show up on labs. It depends on the nutrient. Not all nutrients can be tested by blood. So in particular, calcium is the one that I think of most commonly, because patients will often tell me, well, their calcium levels were fine on their blood work. And the problem with that is that if your calcium is out of whack on your blood work, there's a bigger issue than celiac disease going on. There may be something going on with your parathyroid. There's a lot of other reasons, because the body keeps some of those nutrients in very narrow ranges within our bloodstream, calcium being one of those. And so it keeps it in a very narrow range. And so if we're deficient, if we're not eating enough calcium and we're not absorbing enough calcium, our body keeps that narrow range in our bloodstream. And so it will start pulling it from the bones, right? Because it needs to keep that range in the blood very narrow. And that lab work is going to show that it keeps it in there, but our bones may be taking a hit because it's pulling it out of the pantry, right? The bones are kind of like our pantry of nutrients. So that's where lab work doesn't always tell us everything about all of the nutrients.
Okay, thank you so much. And Stacy, jump in at any point too if I'm missing something. There were a lot of questions about the particular vitamins that you showed as an example. If that was a swallow, a chewable. We can't really recommend specific brands, but if you want to go ahead, Renee, and mention anything.
That was the Target Up and Up brand. It's so easily found that's the why I recommend it most commonly, because and it's inexpensive, right? That's why I like that one the most. Flintstones with iron is no longer gluten-free. For years it was, but Flintstones is no longer gluten-free. So do double check that label. And it does say wheat on it now on the Flintstones. But that's my most common one. There's other ones for kiddos, but again, a lot of the other ones for kiddos are gummies, and they're not complete. So depending on what your kid needs, it may not be including everything that you need.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's too bad about Flintstones.
Yeah.
I know a lot of those compact and compressed vitamins aren't great for absorption too, because sometimes that has to do with like how it's provided, right?
Yeah, and just the chemistry of how they get all of that, right, into that little tablet capsule.
Yeah. The topic of digestive enzymes always comes up. Someone had asked if you find that people overuse digestive enzymes and if you see any implications in your practice.
So digestive enzymes, I don't use very many of them, but I definitely use lactase enzyme. So lactate caplets, things like that. That is one that works. We know that. And so that's very much one that I recommend regularly. I also highly recommend alpha galactosidase, which AKA is Beano. I use Beano. I recommend Bean Assist because it doesn't have any agitating ingredients in it for some of my patients. But sometimes those are the two main ones that I utilize very regularly with patients. Beyond that, generic digestive enzymes that are like a combination of lots of things. No, don't recommend those. Those are not proven to be helpful. And again, too, with supplements, the supplement industry is on its own. It may or may not have what it says in there on the label, and it doesn't necessarily benefit. We want to heal that gut. We want to heal the celiac disease, right? We want to get that absorption back. And in theory, everything should be okay.
Yep. Okay. Sorry, there was, and I'm not sure if you know this, but would most gluten-free bread products be classified as not whole grain? I know I've had discussions with the dietitians at USDA and talking about whole grains being covered by WIC program and SNAP benefits. Do you have
It's
any
a
thoughts on that?
challenge.
Yeah.
It's a challenge to find whole grain products. Again, Kinnick is one of the only ones that fortifies, and then it really is looking at the individual labels of those products, and you want to look for those words whole grain, whole grain sorghum or what have you in there, brown rice flour versus white rice flour, quinoa, things like that. It just, it is challenging to find whole grain products just because chemistry.
Yeah. Yeah.
As you all know from baking or attempting to bake gluten-free, you know how challenging it is too. So
There was a question about liquid iron supplements. Are those beneficial versus a swallow or chewable?
they can be, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that can be an option. I know, like, I think Mary Ruth's brand has a liquid iron. And too, like for like teenage girls, sometimes a liquid iron, because iron supplementation, depending if they need a lot of iron, it can be very constipating. So like, especially like teenage girls with heavy menstrual cycles, I often think of them when they need a lot of iron, and then they get constipated. So sometimes the liquid can be more, less constipating for some people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and there was some discussion about grains. Just another mention. We always mention this a lot in our recipes. Whenever we're talking about grains, we always just make sure to tell people to look for grains labeled gluten-free because of the cross contact with other grains. So not just the, sorry, that I was trying to, I'm multitasking. I know Stacy, you've been really helpful in answering a lot of questions in the chat. We are almost done though. They're speaking to low ferritin levels and dietary supplements to support. I think you had already covered that at the beginning. And so just to let everybody know, this, as we mentioned in the beginning, is recorded, and we will send a follow-up email to all registrants with the recording once we've had a chance to download it and do our editing process, and then it'll be on the website.
Yeah, so ferritin, for those of you that aren't aware, is the storage protein for iron. So when ferritin is low, sometimes iron levels are still normal, quote unquote, but it's kind of, again, like that. We keep a very specific amount in the bloodstream of iron. And so the blood may show that the iron is full or it's within normal limits, but then the ferritin might be low. That's basically your pantry. You're using up your pantry and you're not backfilling it, right? You're not going to Costco enough to get ferritin. So you're not backfilling. And so that can be an early sign of iron. It's a sign of iron deficiency. It's not necessarily that we have full-blown anemia yet. And so we can have low ferritin levels that definitely affect kids and definitely have symptoms. We can see symptoms with that for sure. So yeah, so that's where sometimes if ferritin is low, definitely may want to have a discussion about whether iron supplementation is necessary.
Thank you. There were a couple of other questions, but I think they were answered in the top talk earlier. So definitely look to the recording. We will also send some helpful links in the follow-up email to address some of the questions that were also asked at the beginning about being newly diagnosed and talking about cross-contact with gluten. Renee, did you have anything else to add?
Oh, I'm trying to think. I was just scrolling through the questions too to see if there is anything that jumped out at me to missing. I don't know of any gummies that have minerals in them. Somebody asked that, and then your 12-year-old will only do gummies. So that is a challenge for sure. So that's maybe a situation where it makes sense to do a nutrient lab panel to understand truly what your child needs, so that maybe you can find if they do need iron, you can use a liquid iron versus trying to find a gummy that has iron in it, which is pretty much impossible. So that's where maybe sort of having more information to help you be more specific might be helpful as that parent. Yeah. No, I think that's about it. I think you guys. So pea milk, somebody asked about pea milk as in PEA, as in beans and lentils and peas. It really depends on the brand. You gotta look for that calcium and vitamin D. You gotta see if you're using that as a dairy alternative, you need to look at the label and make sure that it's replacing what you're eliminating out of the diet. So that's with any of the alternative dairy products.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you. And thank you for looking at those yourself too. That's great. Well, thank you all so much for attending. Stacy, thank you for co-hosting.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much, Renee. You've been awesome. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful night and look for our follow-up email.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.